Today's the last day of Anselm, where we looked at Anselm's famous ontological argument last class, but that was a week ago, so I want to do a little bit of reviewing just to keep things fresh in your mind, because I'm guessing, first time that you're exposed to the material, you probably didn't retain that much of it, and if we go back to it and we make connections, you'll retain more of it. So the first thing I actually want to do is have all of you vote about something. Everybody has to vote. This is, otherwise it doesn't work. So you have to raise your hands for one of these. And it could have been while you were in the class session. Maybe you haven't thought about Anselm's argument since we last talked about it in class. But you did think about it. You did have it, in the understanding, as Anselm would say. So there's three options. One is Anselm's argument is convincing for me. I think that he did, in fact, prove that God exists with his particular argument. So you could believe that God exists when you come into class and then say, yeah, but Anselm has a good proof for it. I suppose if you didn't believe that God exists and now you think that Anselm had a good proof for it, you're kind of stuck. You now have to believe that God exists, right? Or you might say Anselm's argument must be wrong. There's got to be something wrong with this. Maybe you know what that is. Maybe you're like Immanuel Kant or Thomas Aquinas. Odds are you're not, and you just have some sort of vague sense that something like a magic trick took place here. I don't know where exactly the rabbit got stuck in the hat, but I think somebody put a rabbit in that hat before they pulled it out. The third possibility is Anselm is onto something. I think he is. I'm not convinced by the argument, but I think there's something going on there. I can't quite put my finger on what it is. So I want you to vote on each one of these. And we'll actually start out in the middle. How many of you think Anselm's argument, it's got to be wrong? And if you're actually, like a committed atheist, you have to think Anselm's argument is wrong, because otherwise it would prove that God exists, right? So how many people think it's got to be wrong? One? Is that it? Nobody else thinks he's got to be wrong? Two? Okay. Three? Okay. So how many think that Anselm's argument, you found it convincing? In some form. You may not have understood the whole thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. How many think that he's onto something and you're not quite sure what it is, but you're sure there must be something more going on there? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay. So that's kind of interesting. You notice that a lot of people, you could say, well, they're just indifferent or something like that, or they didn't vote yet, so they had to find some way to vote. I think if that's really your case, that's because you haven't, read Anselm a lot, and you haven't thought a lot about these sort of things. I'm guessing that you didn't do much reading of great theological thinkers in high school, right? Because we don't do that sort of thing in high school, except in certain schools. If you, in fact, thought that Anselm is onto something, and you have some idea of what it is, or you have no clue as to what it is, what we're going to do today, we'll fill that in. And we're not actually going to talk about whether God exists anymore. We handled that with Proslogion 2-4. So, those are the chapters where he's talking about God's existence. Now we're not looking at God's existence, we're looking at God's attributes. So if you come in and you're a committed atheist and you think God doesn't exist, then look at this as sort of a make-believe. What if God did exist? What would he have to have, or what would it have to have? What kind of attributes? What would those attributes be like? When we say things like God is merciful, do we mean that God is merciful the way that human beings are merciful? That's a big problem. That's a problem in what we call the philosophy of religion, but also the philosophy of language. Because we have these terms like merciful, or just, or powerful, or mighty, or all-knowing, all these sorts of things. Or even terms like light. You notice Anselm talks about God as being light. Does that mean that he's light like these lights up here? Turn God on and off? Break the circuit? Activate the circuit? It can't mean that sort of thing. Does it mean God's like a candle, just a big, big candle? That doesn't make much sense either. So there's got to be something else going on there. And we have to dig in order to figure out what's going on there. And you're going to see that Anselm is actually going to get himself to a point where he says, this is about as far as we can go. We can't actually make this completely understandable, completely comprehensible. So it may not be satisfying to everybody, but we're going to explore it. And you notice when it comes to, it's got to be wrong or I find it convincing, it's about half and half, right? If we take out all the people who think, I don't really know. Some people find it convincing, some people don't. About the same proportion. And that's the way it's been every time that I've taught this material. And if you feel that Anselm's argument is convincing, you're in good philosophical company, because Hegel thought it was convincing, and René Descartes, who we're going to be reading, thought it was convincing. If you think that it's totally unconvincing, you're also in good philosophical company, because Immanuel Kant, who we're going to read, says it's totally, erroneous. It's fallacious. And as a matter of fact, it's the type of argument that all the other arguments about God's existence are based on. They're all bad. Different philosophers have different sides for this. So whichever side you picked, you're in good philosophical company. And you could give some reasons why you think of things that way. Before we go into this stuff, let's think about a key difference. What was the term that Anselm used to try to prove that God must exist? That than which nothing greater can be thought. And you notice he doesn't say something like God is the supreme being. He does think that God is the supreme being, but he doesn't use that in his argument. Let's say we think about his argument again. It ran along these sort of lines. So you've got somebody who says God doesn't exist, right? Anselm called him the biblical fool. The fool says in his heart there is no God. Now, saying it in his heart means that he has some sort of conception in his mind about what we mean by God. And it could be God is the supreme being, or it could be God is that guy in the sky with white robes and a long beard who zaps people. Or it could be that than which nothing greater can be thought. Those are all possibilities. It could be the Savior of Israel. It could be whatever you like. These are all concepts of God. So let's say you start out with God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. You've got it in your mind. You say, yeah, there's something like that in my mind, but that doesn't exist in reality. That's not out there, that's only in here. Sort of like a unicorn, right? Unicorns exist? What do you think? No. Yeah, but you see posters of them on little girls' closet doors. They must exist. Somewhere, right?
Recreate.
Often they have wings too, right? They're not just unicorns, they're Pegasus unicorns. Well, yeah, you're right. They don't exist. Sometimes we have cartoons where, like, the last unicorn gets killed for its tasty, meat or something like that, like a robot chicken or things like that. But that's imaginary. So what the fool is saying is God is imaginary. I can have an idea of God, but there is no such thing. Now, if you have an idea of God as the supreme being, that's not going to get you from the idea of God out to God being in reality. You've got to assume God in reality, and then you can have the idea of God as the supreme being. But if you start out with God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, and you say, yeah, that doesn't exist in reality, then what you're actually doing is you're thinking of something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought. Because to exist in reality, excuse me, is greater than to only exist in the mind. And therefore there's a contradiction. You remember this logic, right? If there's a contradiction, we have to get rid of one of our assumptions. And the assumption that we get rid of is there is no God. This is where it looks like pulling a rabbit out of the hat, right? It looks like something hinky must have gone on there somewhere along the line. What I want you to notice is that can only work if you use this term. It doesn't work if you use the supreme being. You can say, okay, God is the supreme being. Again, I'm the biblical fool, right? I don't believe there's a God. Okay, you've got this idea of a supreme being in your head, can do anything you want, super powerful, sees everything that I'm doing, kind of like, hopped up Santa Claus, all right? And like Santa Claus, hope I'm not bursting anybody's bubble here, doesn't exist. Although, we do have shows about Santa Claus, and we talk about Santa Claus, and we, tell little children that Santa Claus exists. And then, later on when they start figuring things out, we say, oh, he exists in our hearts. But that's not to exist in reality, is it? So I'm the biblical fool, and I'm saying, yeah, supreme being, that's what you call God, doesn't exist. I have an idea of it because I know exactly what I'm rejecting on your part. You have an idea of it because you think it actually exists out here in reality. And now you try to do the same sequence. Well, would you grant that it's greater to exist in reality than to just exist in the mind? Sure. That's exactly why I don't think your God exists. Is what the biblical fool would say, right? And then you say, well, aren't you thinking of something greater than the supreme being then? And thinking of a God that would actually exist in reality? Yeah, okay. You can add as many attributes to the supreme being as you want. You can make it more supreme, right? You can have super God, not just God, but God squared or something like that. That doesn't get you God existing in reality as the conclusion of your argument. This does, if you follow along with Anselm's logic. So there's a big difference between these two ideas. The one of them is kind of a positive idea, isn't it? And the other one is kind of a negative idea. It's more of a restriction on ideas. That's why it seems so mysterious. That's why when you try to wrap your head around it, you struggle. I do myself. I've been researching this and writing about Anselm and the ontological argument. How long now? Almost a decade. As a matter of fact, I went to the first St. Anselm conference and presented on different models of the ontological argument more than 10 years ago. And I've been thinking about it and actually writing a book on it since then. And I still don't fully understand the ontological argument because I can't fully exhaust this idea any more than you can. There's something weird about this idea. Something very different than, say, our idea of a tangible object that we can look at, or your idea of who you are as, Ms. Engel, or Ms. Santos, or any one of you. There's something very different about those kinds of ideas and this kind of idea. So we'll explore that a little bit more. Now, with all of that in mind, what's going on in the Proslogion? Let's look at the introduction to it, or the prologue, the preface. I touched on this a little bit last class, but again, it's been a week, so you've probably forgotten most of that. Anselm says, what am I doing in this whole work? Not just in chapters 2 through 4, but the whole work. I had another work beforehand called the Monologion, and in that work, I was trying to think about, what God must be like, and if God exists, and, is God 3 in 1, or just 1, or, all these sorts of things. And I had a whole bunch of arguments, and they seemed to be kind of jumbled together in one big heap, and I wanted to try to make it more simple, more straightforward, and so I tried to boil it down to one single argument, and that argument would be enough to prove itself and a whole bunch of things. What did Anselm say his goal was to do in the Proslogion, in the preface of it? What did he want to do with this argument? What did he want to prove? Yeah?
The existence of God.
That's one really big thing. So, he wants to prove that God exists. And, we talked about this before. Are there a lot of atheists in Anselm's time? Whether the Christian world or the Muslim world, or, pick anywhere else in the world? Not a lot. So it's kind of a strange thing to do, but he does it nonetheless. That's not all he's doing, though. What else does he want to prove? What does he say in that text? God exists. Something else about God, yeah.
That God is that than which nothing greater can be thought.
Well, that's
So
what,
I prove that.
that's what he's going to use as his linchpin for that. But he's not actually going to prove that. He's going to use that as an assumption. What does he say he wants to prove? Some other attribute of God besides existing. What are other things that we say about God? People in our society. They have more or less the same conception of God as Anselm did. Why do people go to church? If you don't go to church, I'm sure you know some people who go to church. What do they think they're doing there? In some degenerate times, people went to church to hook up, right? But that's not usually what happens in church these days. You could make deals. Maybe it's a good place to do business. Well, that's not really why most people go to church either. Or at least they're not supposed to be, right? Well, some people do. Why do people go to church and bother with all this God stuff? Yeah.
To be free of sins.
Say again?
To free their sins.
To be free of their sins? Okay. Well, what are sins? That's a theological concept. What do we mean when we say that sort of thing? Or what do you have in mind when you think about it?
Things that people think are morally wrong.
Okay, very good. So things that people think are morally wrong. I was actually talking about this earlier today in ethics class. Thomas Aquinas talks about sins in two different ways. You can think about them as a moral philosopher and say sins are those acts that are morally wrong, or you can think of them theologically and say sins are acts God doesn't like, doesn't want you to do. Remember we talked about this with the Euthyphro, right? Piety is doing the things God wants you to do and not doing the things he doesn't want you to do. So God is concerned with goodness. You think God is good? Generally, that's what people have thought, right? And if you start bringing in goodness, yeah. Start bringing in goodness. Let's say you got God or a really good sub sandwich. Tough choice. A really good sub sandwich is really good when you're hungry, right? Really good sub sandwich or eternal beatitude with the creator of the universe. Which do you pick? Sandwich?
Sandwich.
Let's assume, for the moment, to make this example work, that you picked God instead, right? Why? What are you getting out of that? You know, a lot of people's notions of heaven, when you look at them, seem extremely boring.
They're getting security.
Okay, security. That could, so maybe security is the feeling of security is a better good than, for me, a meatball sandwich. That's my favorite kind of stuff. Is there anything else maybe in the picture? I mean, actually, you know, if feeling of security really matters to you, and believing in God makes you feel secure, that might be a good practical reason to believe in God. There are some arguments, I don't think very good arguments, but there are some arguments about God's existence that run along those sort of lines. I don't teach them to you because I don't consider them to be particularly good arguments, but people do make them. Well, I mean, think about God in terms of the different kinds of goods. Remember, we talked about different kinds of goods back when we did Aristotle. So what are the things you guys consider good? Sub sandwiches, we know that.
Family.
Family, okay. Security. What do you get out of family? Not everybody's family is a great experience. Some people hate their family. I'm not one of them, by the way. I'm just telling you, I know some people who do hate their family. And if you know their families, you might hate them too.
So we'll always be there.
Okay, so again, it's sort of like security, right? Maybe with loyalty thrown in. Do you like your family? Do you enjoy being with them? So there's pleasure that comes with that? Might be more pleasant to go to a movie with one of your family members than by yourself or with some chance acquaintance. So family, food, security. What else do you guys value? What makes you tick? What are you looking for in life? Oops. Silence that. What else are you guys looking for? You had all sorts of things when we talked about Aristotle.
Pleasure.
Yeah, various pleasures. I mean, there are some really great pleasures out there. If you haven't experienced a lot of pleasure yet, you got a lot of stuff in store for you. Because, there's so many different things that are pleasant that you can enjoy. Some of them take a little bit of refinement. You got to, sort of educate yourself. And I'm not a good wine drinker because I'm too lazy to educate my palate to really be able to appreciate a wine. I know what I like to drink, and that's it. There's ones for the table, and there's slightly more refined ones for dessert. And that's about it for me. But I know some people who, actually, as a matter of fact, I have a friend who teaches students how to appreciate wine over at the culinary. And I sat in on his class, and I learned what one would do if you truly appreciated wine. And it takes a lot of work. One reason I'm not planning on following up on that. But, there's pleasures of the mind. When you truly understand Aristotle or Anselm, or really any of the other subject matters that you guys are studying, that you're going to major in, there's a great pleasure that comes with that. Something going beyond pleasure, though, too. Take, for instance, criminal justice, because I know you're studying criminal justice, right? Let's assume that you end up becoming a case manager or something like that, because there's a lot of different ways you could go with criminal justice. Let's just assume that's what ends up happening. That means you're going to be writing reports, you're going to be making decisions about people's lives. Should this person go back to prison? Should this person be released and be under surveillance? Does this person deserve to not be under surveillance? Let's say you actually get the sort of support that you're supposed to have, which often doesn't pan out, and you make good decisions about that. You will feel pleasure in doing your job well. You'll feel pleasure in doing the sort of activity that you've trained for. But you'll feel a sort of satisfaction that goes beyond that, won't you? That's a good thing. That's something I desire for all of you. And anybody who wishes you well should desire that, I think. You should wish that for each other, right? It's a good thing for you to desire that for other people. Now let's think about God. If there really is such a thing as God, where would he fit in all these goodnesses? Down at the bottom? High up? What do you think? Why do people go off in the desert and become monks? Do they just like getting a tan? It's quiet out there. Not a lot of people bugging you about this and that. You can get that, just go to another town. Right? And nobody knows you.
You want to be alone to worship God.
Yeah, so those guys at least thought, and remember, Anselm is one of those guys. They thought that God is the greatest good, and that which makes all the other goods good. Not everybody believes this, right? I mean, obviously, if you don't believe there's a God, you're not going to think that God is the good that makes all other goods what they are. You'd never get off the ground. I mean, you could actually be an atheist and say, yeah, well, if there was a God, he or she or it would be ultimately good, but there isn't any such thing, so we don't have to worry about it. Or you might be an atheist and say, if there's going to be a God, I expect that God to be so good that there wouldn't be any evil in the world. This is actually one of the arguments against God's existence that people make, called the argument from evil. Then Anselm has another thing. He says, okay, we're going to prove that God exists, we're going to prove that God is good, and then what else are we going to prove? This is kind of a trick question. Does anyone remember what he says? He says, and everything else that we believe about God. So you got this kind of, let's call it the metaphysical junk drawer. You guys are all familiar with the junk drawer? notion? You guys have a junk drawer at home? You know what I mean when I say junk drawer? You might call it something else. It might not actually be a drawer for you. It could be like, some sort of storage thing. What am I talking about when I say a junk drawer? Do any of you have something like that at home? Yeah. So what do you do with a junk drawer? Yeah.
Just throw stuff in it.
Yeah, like, you don't know where the tape goes, throw it in the junk drawer. Got a couple extra screws left over, throw them in the junk drawer. Pretty soon that junk drawer gets pretty full of stuff. Then maybe you need a bigger junk drawer, right? So when we talk about the miscellaneous, just throw everything else in there. Well, that's what we mean. What else do people believe about God? Or say about God? And I don't have things in mind like he's got a long beard. That's not a very interesting metaphysical property. Yeah. Oh, you're just adjusting your glasses. Okay. What are the kind of things that people do say about God? Typically. Whether you believe them or not. They made a candy? Is that one of the things they say? Oh, what a sweet God he is.
He's above everything.
Okay, so they exalted. There's that notion of height, being greater. There's a lot of ways to phrase that. What else goes along with that? Usually, let me put it to you like this. This is a leading question. How is God like Santa Claus in the notions? Christmas is coming up. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake.
He has power.
Yeah, well, that's omnipotence. We usually say that God is all-powerful, right?
Well, that's what Anselm says about him, about God.
Yeah, exactly. And Anselm says that because that's the sort of thing that Christians and Jews and Muslims have said about God throughout the ages, and they probably will be, forever. I was thinking actually more of omniscience, right? Santa Claus is kind of omniscient, isn't he? Sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, which is a little bit creepy. He knows if you've been bad or good, so you better be good, the way the song goes, for goodness sake. Because if you don't, then he will get you. Santa Claus doesn't really get you in any major sense. Back in my childhood, I actually did get coal in my stocking some years. It was charcoal briskets, because they wanted to send me a message. Shape up. Now, the notion of God as being all-knowing is that God could actually look into every human heart and know what's going on. Or if a butterfly dies over on the other side of the world, God would know about it. That's omniscience. What are other things people say about God? All-powerful, omniscient, good. Anything else? Can God do bad stuff?
According to Anselm, he can't. He or she can't.
Yeah, well, do most Christians think that God can do bad things? Anselm is pretty typical in this respect. Yeah.
But isn't that kind of like going against even what the Bible says? Because doesn't God even feel bad after he floods the world? And he's like, that wasn't like, he's like, I won't do that again. It was kind of mean.
Well, he doesn't come out and say it was kind of mean or anything like that. That's our sort of interpretation of that. This is actually a problem because there are other verses where it says like I create good and evil, like in Isaiah. But typically, Jews, Christians, Muslims, bless you.
Thank you.
We'll try to argue away something like that by saying, well, it's the grand scheme of things, it's the best thing. And there are some real legitimate philosophical problems there. But that's one that we're not, unfortunately, going to have that much time to explore, called the problem of evil. If God is so good, where'd all this evil come from? But in general, people think of God as in some ways not being able to do certain things. Or else he wouldn't be God. Like St. Augustine says, well, if you think God is going to lie to you, you got a different conception in mind than that of God. You're thinking of something different than God. But then it sounds like God doesn't have a power, does he? Sounds like God's not omnipotent, because to be omnipotent means what? What does omni mean? Back to your Latin prefixes. All, right? And potent, powerful. So if God is omnipotent, he should be able to do everything, right? So there's a paradox there. We're going to look at that paradox in a couple minutes. I want to look at a few other paradoxes too. One of the things that Anselm says about God is that God is merciful. Where is he getting this? Well, the Bible, right? Talk about God being a merciful God and all that. But they also talk about God as being a just God. Now, what do you know about merciful people? What are they inclined to do?
Forgive people.
Exactly. So, and when do you forgive people? Do you just go down the street, I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you, just spreading forgiveness all around? Who do you forgive?
The wrongdoers.
People who've done you wrong, yeah. So if God is merciful, that means that he lets some people off the hook. What does it mean to be just? Think back to your Plato and a little bit of Aristotle that we read. What does justice mean? Not the interest of the stronger, right? Because that was just Thrasymachus. Yeah.
Treat people accordingly.
Treat people accordingly, or give them what they deserve, right? Now, if I'm a bad guy and I've hurt you, what do I deserve? Do I deserve mercy? No, I deserve that you hurt me in return, or do something to me, or punish me. So if God is both just and merciful, then somebody like me who's done a number of wrong things in my lifetime, should he do both at once? Can he do both at once? Can he be both just and treat me the way I deserve to be treated, and yet also sort of let me have the benefit of the doubt or another chance? Can he do that? That seems like a contradiction there, doesn't it? That's a problem. That's one we're not actually going to explore. I'm going to put some stuff in iLearn if you're really interested in that, because I've done some writing on that. As a matter of fact, my first article on Anselm that was ever published was about God's justice and God's mercy, and how could they actually be reconciled. And there's some gyrations required for that. Can you think of any other sort of problems with this notion of God? And all this we're going to throw everything in and we're going to prove all of this stuff. Anything else come to mind? Some contradictions, some paradoxes, things that have bothered you. They don't necessarily have to be in Anselm's text. Because Anselm, if he were here, he would try to address any sort of objections people would have. I mean, say, yeah, that sounds like a real issue. I'd better think about that. What are other problems that come up with the idea of God that you run into from time to time? Talking about reconciling goodness and evil in the world, power and not being able to do certain things, mercy and justice. Anything else you could think about that didn't make sense to you when somebody tried to tell you God is this and God is this at the same time? And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Just take it on faith. Is there anything like that in your experience? Because maybe Anselm talked about it. How about like God is everywhere? Really? You mean like in my coffee cup? Or in my heart? In your heart? In the desk? All around us? How come I don't see him then? Anselm actually talks about that, doesn't he? In chapters 14 and 15 and 16. Let's look at the section where he actually does treat one of these things. The issue about power and not being able to do certain things. So, And we don't have to stick necessarily to what Anselm talks about. Let's sort of like pretend we're making a Family Guy episode. Or what are other cartoons? Do you guys watch these kind of funny cartoons where you don't watch these cartoons like Simpsons or Family Guy or Robot Chicken or any of those sort of things? Or they kind of make fun of God sometimes. South Park. South Park is pretty good with that. How many of you watch those kind of shows? Only a few? And then we have to put ourselves in some other sort of frame. I don't know exactly what I would use to as an example for you. But let's think about it this way. What are some things you think God shouldn't be able to do? If he's going to be God, or it's going to be God, or however you want to put it. What are some ideas that you have about that? Doesn't matter how crazy it sounds to you, or even perhaps silly. We can explore it. What ideas? What shouldn't God? What are things that God shouldn't be able to do? And still be God. Yeah.
Influence your decisions.
Oh. That's an interesting one. Influence human, like maybe determine them, like take away your free will? Take away free will, okay. That is one that Anselm talks about, not in this book, but in other books. Take away your free will. That's a good one. We'll explore that in a minute. Let's get some other ones though too. I mean, the old medieval one is, could God create a stone so heavy he couldn't lift it? Well, either way, it's a problem. If he can't create that stone, it sounds like he can't do everything. And if he can create a stone so heavy he can't lift, that sounds like a problem too. Let's think about some other things. Put aside the notion that Christians have that God became incarnate. Can God comb his hair?
Does he have hair?
That would be a problem, right? So, some very trivial thing. Comb his hair. What else? What are other things that, given the notion of God that we tend to work with in this society, God might not be able to do?
You can't walk around on earth.
Okay, yeah, other than this notion that, the Christians have that Jesus was incarnate, God at one time, or however you want to frame it. He can't, you mean we can't walk around physically on earth, or?
Yeah, we don't see God walking around, no.
Okay, so let's say that he can't take a walk. And this is kind of an interesting one, because if you think about the Bible, in the very first book, it treats God in very anthropomorphic terms, in terms very much like a human being. So it talks about God walking around in the garden and saying, hey, where are you? Which doesn't sound like the kind of thing that would be omniscient. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe could God be confused if he's God or it's God? So not being confused. Another one that a lot of people have puzzled about: could God make past things different than they are? So somewhere along the line, I used to actually be in really good physical shape. Believe it or not, you wouldn't guess it by looking at me. But when I was your age, I was about 190 pounds and just in prime physical condition. I was in the Army and we used to do a 5-mile run. And I was a smoker back then. And I was in such good shape, I could actually run and smoke at the same time. And it didn't bother me. Now, of course, the more you do that, pretty soon you can't run and smoke at the same time. Let's say, God says, I'm not really happy with the way things turned out for you, Greg Sadler. You let yourself go. I'm going to go and change the past, and this would be sort of like Mr. Roth's idea about God changing your mind or determining you, except it would be going in the past, and so God interferes with my free will and says, okay, you're not going to stop working out, and you're not going to eat whatever you want for the next 10 years. And then suddenly, poof, here I am, and I'm 40 pounds lighter, and a good portion of that is big muscle. And I'm up in front of the class now, teaching. I look very different, right? Maybe I'm not wearing a sweater, I'm wearing a very neatly tailored European suit. And I look vital, and all these sorts of things. Could God do that sort of thing? Could he go in and tinker with the past to make the past no longer be what it was so that the present would turn out differently? Sort of like these sci-fi things where somebody goes back in time. Yeah.
Shouldn't he have gotten it right in the first place? He's so powerful.
Oh, there's a problem there, isn't there? Or omniscient, or all good, right? Each one of these would seem to be like a restriction on God being all-powerful, wouldn't it? If God can't do these things, actually in this case, even if God can do it, it seems like it's a problem. But now that's getting us towards the solution. Other things that they'll bring up is, could God lie? Could God do bad things deliberately? Now think about what happens with some of these things. And let's take lying, for an example. Or being confused. Is being confused a good thing? No? What happens when you're confused?
You get frustrated.
Okay, there's effects, there's emotional effects. I feel that too. As a matter of fact, the worst thing is when you have two people that are talking to each other and they're both confused and then they get frustrated with each other and they're arguing and then they start saying, well, I think the argument's about this, and the other person says, no, it's about this, and then it just escalates, right? But then, let's put that aside. Let's put the emotional stuff aside. Being confused is not a good thing, and to be confused means in some way not actually having a power. It means something else having power over you, doesn't it? Something else being more powerful than you. So it's not really, to be confused is not a state of power. What about lying? When do people lie? Let's think about our own experience. I know I lie, which I have done, when I feel too uncomfortable telling the truth. Because I would be too embarrassed to tell the truth. I'm trying to think about it. I think I have lied at some points in time just to get an advantage over somebody else. Especially in an argument. I used to be a really vicious arguer. Quite mean to people, other graduate students. And I would say that I knew something that I didn't actually know. What was driving me? The urge to beat somebody else. Why else do people lie, in your experience? Why have people lied to you in the past? To get away with things, right. Now, what was going on in those people who wanted to get away with things? Were they just, perfectly fine, and they just chose to lie out of the blue to get away with something? Or was there something going on with them? Yeah.
They were afraid of the punishment.
It could be they're afraid of punishment.
They feel guilty for what they did.
Yeah, that's a prime one. That often leads to more lies.
They
Yeah.
got them.
Or they want to like have their cake and eat it.
Yeah, we often want to have our cake and eat it too. We want things to be both ways for us and be exceptions to the rule. So now you can pick a million different scenarios. What were you going to
So
say?
they got themselves into a situation that they can't get out of, like, without a lie.
There you go. Yeah, that's similar to the other ones that we brought up. Now notice what all of these have in common. Again, it looks like lying is the exercise of a power, doesn't it? But it's really something that you do when something else has power over you. Whether it's embarrassment, or why do people want to have their cake and eat it too? What's going on with them?
Being selfish.
Yeah, they're being selfish. They're being driven by their own selfish desires. They're giving into a worse part of themselves. They're not giving into their better part. We generally don't actually give into our better parts. We give into our worse parts, and sometimes we obey our better parts, don't we? And if that's the case, is that really the exercise of a power? Or is that being less powerful? If you lie or cheat or steal or kill people indiscriminately or do these things that we're not supposed to do, you're not doing them generally because you feel like you're so powerful and you can do anything you want. You're doing them because something else is constraining you, because you feel powerless. And this is one way to try to get some of that power back. So if God were to be able to lie, God would in fact be less than what God is. To be omnipotent would actually mean that you couldn't lie, because to be able to lie means being able to have something else over you. Comb his hair or take a walk, they're probably not quite the same thing as lying. If God had a physical body, let's put aside this troublesome case of this Jesus Christ guy, right? Let's just take omnipotent, omniscient, creator of the universe sort of idea that people have. This is a problem that a lot of people had with Christianity when it first came out. They said, wait a minute, your God got nailed on a cross? What the hell kind of God is that? You mean he walked around and he didn't hang out with the rich and the mighty, but he hung out with a bunch of dirty fishermen and riffraff? What are you talking about? That was one of the problems that a lot of people had in the early Roman Empire, or the late Roman Empire, early Christian era with Christianity, because it seemed like that doesn't sound much like a divine figure at all. It sounds like the divine should be very exalted. If God has a body, it should be like a super body, right? God would have to be super attractive and great physical shape, Have any ever looked at the image that they came up? National Geographic came up with this composite image of what Christ probably would have looked like. It doesn't look like the pictures that we have in all these churches. It's got kind of a squat nose and kind of looks a little bit like Socrates. Would it be a power to be able to have physical form, to be constrained to physical form? Well, this is a good question. We can make it very prosaic. All of you in the class who have long hair, right? You're sort of right on the verge of long and short. But you probably had longer hair at one time, right? Why is long hair kind of a pain? What do you dislike about having long hair? What bothers you about it sometimes?
It gets tangled.
It gets tangled, right? What else?
Drags and things.
Yeah. That's why you often, some of you actually have your hair tied back, right? What else? Yeah.
Hard to maintain.
Yeah, you gotta put conditioner in it, wash it, and then the ends get split, and you gotta go to the hair cutter, hairdresser, get it cut, and it doesn't look exactly the way that you want it to. And how about it gets hot in the summertime? Long hair gets kind of hot, right? So it's nice to shave it every once in a while. So, if God could walk around and have hair and stuff like that, would that really be to be powerful? What do you think? If God had a physical body, would that really be taking on powers? What goes wrong with your body? A good prime example right there, right? What's wrong? What's going on with your body that makes you feel not so hot right now? Coughing because you're sick. If God had a physical body, God could presumably get sick. Is getting sick an example of actually having power? It's something else having power over you. So again, with all these examples, what is Anselm saying? We don't really think of power the right way. We think of power as being able to do anything. But there's a lot of things that if you could do, it would really mean another thing having power over you. Like we've used this example before, any one of you could get addicted to heroin if you wanted to. I could too. Is that really a power? The junkie might think to themselves, yeah, I'm on top of the world while they're high. But that desire has a control over them. So this is how Anselm reconciles these sorts of things. He does a similar thing with mercy and justice. He does another similar thing with, how can God actually know everything and in a certain sense see everything when he doesn't have eyeballs? He doesn't see physical things the way we do. It's two hats, right, on men's heads in this classroom. One is black and has a Yankees thing on it. One is blue and is that Texas?
Yeah.
Okay. And has a Texas Rangers.
Mm-hmm.
Has a Texas Rangers thing on it. Does God actually know these hats in that way, the way I do, seeing things with my eyes? Maybe that doesn't make sense to think about it that way. But if that's the case, maybe God doesn't know everything. Anselm has an answer for that one. We're not going to go into that one, but I just want to sort of gesture towards it. Let's move now to all this talk about light and the inaccessible light in which God dwells, because that's where Anselm is getting really kind of bothered. And you notice if you read through those passages, it doesn't read like somebody who's solved every single problem. It reads like somebody who thinks that he's learned some things about God by using that notion of that than which nothing greater can be thought, and saying, well, that must mean this, and it must mean that. And he's thought his way through some problems, but he still says, in very anguished terms, why is it, God, if I know this stuff about you, that I don't sense your presence? This is a holy guy. This is a guy who is living his life in prayer, who, from the biography that we have of him, he looks like a pretty decent human being, and yet he doesn't feel like he actually grasps God. He says, I know by all these arguments that I put together that you are everywhere, that you made me, that you're all good, you're all knowing, you're all powerful, you have all these attributes. Why don't I sense that? If you're everywhere, why don't I see you? Well, there could be two ways to go with that, right? Let's think about a more commonsensical thing. Let's take God out of the picture. Let's use this coffee cup as an example. All of you see this coffee cup right now? What could, the coffee cup could exist and you not see it, right? How could that happen? Well, I could hide it over here. Now you can't see it. But let's say the coffee cup is out. Some of you are seeing it right now, and some of you aren't. Why? Because some of you did what? This is kind of a good example, actually.
Looked away.
Yeah. Some of you are looking right at it, and some of you are looking at mostly at your computer screens. You're looking at something else. But you could also just turn around, not look at it. I'm not going to look at that coffee cup. You could willfully not see it. Are there other things that could interfere with you seeing it? This is a physical object, right? What else could interfere with you seeing this coffee cup?
The angle that you're sitting at.
Oh, yeah, you could be blocked by somebody else, right? Especially if you're sitting in the back and you're shorter than some of the other women sitting in front of you. What else? Somebody could turn out the lights and then maybe we won't see anything. Or it could be foggy in here. Or you could be drunk. You could get so drunk you can't actually focus your eyes. There's all sorts of possibilities. And that's just talking about a coffee cup, which is a physical object that you actually do sense. Excuse me. Now, if we're thinking about a human being, let's call it a human knower, and then God as what is being known. Some of those things could come up as well. The example of looking away, right? Maybe some people don't know anything about God because they look at other stuff instead, right? That doesn't seem that difficult. Maybe you actually, when you got your idea of God, you didn't get the right idea. If you got the idea of God as just being this guy up in the sky somewhere who's gonna be Super Santa Claus and punish you when you're naughty, which is what some people tell in Sunday school or CCD. That's the image. Certainly that's the image I got when I was a kid and went to CCD. That and then the other contradictory thing. God is love and just wants you to be nice to each other. And he's just kind of warm fuzzy. Maybe those aren't actually. Maybe that's some other idea. So if you're looking at these other ideas, you're not going to see the actual reality, if there is one, right? This is all making the assumption there is a God. Could anything else be screwing this up? I mean, you could actually turn deliberately away and say, I'm not going to learn anything about any of this sort of stuff. This is all garbage. That would certainly keep you from being able to know anything about God, wouldn't it? Could there be anything that's equivalent to being blind drunk in this?
Being ignorant of God.
Being ignorant, yeah. And maybe,
Not knowing what God is or who God is.
Yeah, it was interesting. I came from the Midwest. And the Midwest, I think, is a lot like the area that you guys grew up in for the most part. Where all of you, whether you're religious or not, you know people who are religious, right? Everyone in here knows some people who are religious and other people who aren't. And there's some people who are religious that are real serious about it, and they seem to be on track with it, and there's other people who seem to be real religious and it's kind of for show, right? And then there's some people who are not religious, and maybe if they had some religion they'd be better people, and then there's some other people who aren't religious and they're pretty good people, right? So you've got a wide range of experience. I had a friend who was from California. California is a very secular area in some parts of it. And we would talk about religion, and he literally had nothing to pin these ideas on. Because the culture that he grew up in didn't have any religious people. Period. Or if it did, he just didn't really have any contact with them. And so when it came to talking about these ideas, he had a very, very difficult time figuring out how somebody could possibly be interested in this or take this stuff seriously. Whereas all of you can even if you don't, you think it's all BS, you can still understand how somebody could take it seriously, right? those of you who are religious, I think all of you can sort of figure out why somebody else might have problems with religion, right? You're sort of in the middle zone. Probably there's an equivalent where everybody in the society is so hyper-religious that you can't possibly relate to anybody in the middle zone or on the other zone. That would be sort of like the religious version of that secular thing. He didn't have anything when it came to this stuff. So a certain kind of ignorance, right? A lack of experience, yeah.
If he says that God is everywhere, if God really is everywhere, then why does everybody need to be taught by other human beings what God is?
That's a good question.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Anselm could give a response, and let me go along with the response he's going to give, because I think that will sort of align with that. So when he's trying to think of his own example, again, we've got this guy who's a monk. He's been, trying to get close to God for a long time. So if he can't get close to God, what's the chance of poor slobs like us, right? But what he notices is it could be, and he suggests this as a possibility, that God is sort of like the sun. You can see things in sunlight pretty well, can't you? Can you look straight at the sun and see what it looks like? Maybe for an instant. And then what happens to your eyes? Don't do this, by the way. Right? There are some people who willfully look at the sun for 5-10 minutes at a time. What happens if you do that? Burn your eyeballs, actually. The light going in burns the back of your eyes, the rods and the cones, burns your retinas. Maybe God is so powerful. Again, this is Anselm's idea. Maybe God is so powerful, so incredible, includes so much, that the human mind is not able to take in all of that, and can only take in a portion, just a tiny sliver of what it is that God is. Not the reality itself. That's what he's suggesting, right? In those chapters, he's saying, God, maybe it's not just that my eyes themselves are darkened, maybe that you're so bright that I can't take it in. You've all been blinded before, right? Somebody flashed a camera in your face, or you got too close to sparklers at 4th of July, or anything like that, and then you can't make things out. Does that mean that the things aren't there? It just means you can't see them as well. Or you've all had a flashlight in your face at night? Hopefully not from a cop shining it in your face. As you're being pulled over or something like that.